This quarter, we will trace the rise of two global superpowers and their effect on fashion, Britain and the United States. Britain rose to power during the Industrial Revolution, establishing factories that changed the way fabric was made. Both American and British power will be earned on stolen land using stolen labor in the New World, and we will also track fashion's part in this larger picture. This presentation will explore 18th century style, French versus British style, class distinctions in dressing style, and the dawn of American style. In the 18th century, what would eventually become the United States was divided between the British, French, Spanish, and a few Russian claims. Of particular note to budding North American fashion is the area in yellow marked the Hudson's Bay Company. This land was owned by a corporation, at one time the largest landholder in the world. The Hudson's Bay Company was granted a monopoly over all furs traded in the area. First Nations people and European trappers traded their furs for other goods, such as wool blankets, which they found lighter in weight and able to dry more quickly. We'll see more of those blankets later, so remember the Hudson's Bay Company. The colonies did not have a voice of their own. They looked to Europe to provide culture and fashion trends. Fashions from London and Paris were much in demand for the wealthy. In 1753, the British painter William Hogarth published a book called The Analysis of Beauty, summarizing the aesthetics of that time. The S line signified the most elegant beauty. It stood for liveliness and it excited the attention of the viewer, unlike straight lines, which were considered boring, unimaginative, or even dead. The S-curve was in the zeitgeist. This is a painting of an aerial view of the Palace of Versailles, where the royal court of France lived all together in residence with the king. We can see a procession entering the front gate in the lower right-hand corner. Even though the main entryway is straight, we can see the procession is lined up in an S-curve. This is more elegant than a straight line. The wealthy had time, money, and the inclination to do everything with utmost refinement. Merchants and servants scurried about in straight lines, not the well-bred aristocrat. About 10 years ago, I found this ad seen on the left for a new condo building in Los Angeles. The copy read, "The finer things available to those who deserve it. Not for everyone, but everything to a select few." Since I had been an art history major, I recognized how similar this ad is to the 18th century portrait at the right, where our aristocratic woman sits in an S-curve, not bolt upright like her ancestors in the 17th century would have, or worse, a Puritan or a banker. The advertising company clearly copied this portrait to convey the same message, everything to a select few. This is truly the spirit of 18th century Europe and France in particular, and was the driver for their fashion. Aristocrats learned elaborate manners to set themselves apart. A middle-class person could earn a fortune, but would never quite fit in because they didn't know all the intricate rituals. Aristocrats hired ballet masters to teach their children the proper deportment. How to sit, stand, and handle your clothing were all important factors. Let's take a look at the interiors that wealthy Europeans lived in. We will see some of the same ideas of beauty reflected in the clothing. We can see elaborately figured silk fabric attached to the wall. We have some new technology at work, crystal glass chandeliers. New advances in glassmaking created a way to bounce light off the crystals and around the room. The furniture, frames, and wall molding are gilt with gold, adding to the shine. No surface is left untouched. Interiors were extremely elaborate during this period. We can see this love of glitter and gold in some new fashion inventions, the sequin and gold bullion embroidery. The ground of this fabric is a shiny satin. The overall effect is lively with light. Sequins during this time were flat, such as the example you see at the bottom right. Bullion embroidery uses gold beaten into tiny wires that are coiled around threads for sewing. This 18th century cartoon makes fun of a man who proudly displays shiny buttons, stunning his unsuspecting companion. Buttons were very expensive to make, and some could be tiny works of art with paintings or cut gems in them. We began cutting gems, and particularly diamonds, in the 18th century to get more glitter from them. This woman appears to be wearing earrings with multiple cut stones in them. Another new technology is the jacquard loom that will allow European textile mills to weave complicated patterns we call brocade. Until this invention, Italy had a stranglehold on the import and manufacture of this fabric that came from the Middle East and beyond. With the aid of mechanization, we will see this fabric appear in more 18th century fashions. The love of surface decoration is also evident in this man's velvet suit jacket with floral embroidery. Wearing an expensive fabric like velvet was not a male or female marker during this time, but a sign of wealth. This man was proud to wear embroidered flowers all over his coat. Suits like these were reserved for formal wear, not everyday wear, and the more decoration you could afford, obviously, the wealthier you were. Wealthy people were expected to advertise their rank or the size of their wealth in their wardrobes. There was a very big difference between the way the French and British dressed that would directly affect what will become American style. The French style was most elaborate, and their fashions were widely copied all over Europe. They favored lighter pastel colors, surface decoration, and more showy fabrics such as satin and velvet. The French put an emphasis on outer display as a status symbol, as well as showing their love of refinement. In England, the aristocracy lived on their country estates, not all in one great palace, as did the French. No matter how wealthy or refined they may be, English aristocrats were also involved in some of the day-to-day decisions of running an agricultural estate. They spent far more time riding and hunting than practicing ballet steps. When they did come to the royal court, they also dressed in fancy attire. But for all other occasions, they favored more simplified styles. Men wore suits made of wool and breeches of leather for riding. They used stronger colors, less decoration. Men who did wear French styles were known as fops or macaronis. The fashions we see in many portraits and fashion plates from this time are the highest fashions, but just like today, very few people wear runway quality clothing every day. Let's look at some of the ways different classes dressed. We will see some fashion rules that will hold true throughout the 19th and 20th centuries too. How fashion trickles down from the wealthiest to the poorest people in a society. This portrait shows us how people would have looked in a group setting. The wealthiest person wears incredibly expensive fabric and fine lace. Her hair and makeup are perfect because she has servants to dress her each and every day. She also wears the most formal shape, wide panniers that make her skirts stand out on the sides. She is the largest person in this grouping, and we can see right away she is the highest ranking. There are also two ladies' maids. The one on the left wears green. They would have been women from good families, but lesser rank. They wear good dresses, and notice they do not wear the pannier shape, but a modest version. Their hair is styled most likely by another servant. The household servant in the background wears much plainer clothing. Her colors are drab, her fabric is humble and sturdy, and it would be washed more often. Since she has little time for elaborate hairstyles, she wears her hair pulled back under a cap. The wealthy gentleman on the left wears a suit with many fine details outlined in trim and white stockings. This fabric is very good quality and the suit fits him well. This slide shows what an aristocratic lady could wear every day at home, or this could be best dress for a wealthy middle-class woman. The wide panniers were not worn on a daily basis except at court, so a middle-class woman would probably never wear them at all. Her skirt is indeed shaped, but with more modest pads under her skirt. This woman wears expensive fabrics that show a lot of labor to produce. She has indulged in a satin petticoat that is shiny. The wealthy middle-class man's suit could be three pieces like this one, good quality fabric, that is plain. But he could still afford lots of satin and decorative buttons. This is much more like what an average middle-class woman, who still had servants doing the household labor, would wear every day. Her overdress could be long or short, like this example. This fabric is printed, not expensive brocade. Her petticoat is quilted, just like a wealthier woman's petticoat, but is not shiny satin. The man's suit on the right has plain buttons. This is a lightweight summer suit and is made of linen dyed with butternuts. The working classes wore newly made clothes of very practical and sturdy fabrics. These styles are simplified versions of what is fashionable. They lack any of the details that might fluctuate with trends, like the shape of a neckline or types of decoration. Men's coats could be shapeless and sometimes shorter to spare the expense of fabric. There was also a brisk business in second-hand clothing. We see out-of-fashion coats and jackets stay alive in the working classes for up to 30 years past their time. The poorest working-class women wore this short blouse called jumps. This is an uncorseted fashion and could be seen on enslaved women or the very poor. This is why we say that fashion did not really exist for the working classes until we reach mass manufacture in the late 19th century. The latest styles were absolutely out of reach for the working classes. By the time of the American Revolution, some colonists had developed ways of dressing that were uniquely North American. It is interesting to note that no high-ranking member of a European noble family ever lived in the colonies. There were a minuscule number of truly upper-class residents, and they tended to dress in the European styles. Colonial society developed free from the aristocratic system of dressing for royal functions to set the styles. Although some of the founding fathers were based on country estates like the British gentry were, many were working professionals such as doctors, lawyers, merchants, and traders. One, Benjamin Rush, was even a professor who wrote a textbook. They were generally middle class, even though they might make fortunes for themselves in the New World, they never became aristocratic. They adopted the more functional attire of the British for their everyday wear, although they would import both French and English fashions for special occasions. Some of the colonies had been founded by religious societies. Many of them objected to the vanity of aristocratic fashions, creating actual laws about plain or modest dress. Many Americans inherited this Protestant disdain for fashion. The French colonies in the South and in Canada also imported fashions from Paris. Merchants would send fashion dolls, seen at the left, to advertise the latest styles and fabrics for mail order. The middle classes wore simpler adaptations. In the middle image, we see a woman wearing a short gown over a petticoat. The colonists lived in weather that was much colder or much hotter than France's temperate climate, so fashions would be interpreted in heavier or lighter fabrics. Colonists tended to wear more leather and fur to keep warm as well. The Spanish colonies tended to be in the hotter climates, similar to the climate of Spain, so upper-class colonists kept their European fashions. These colonies were eager to keep their home language and culture alive. The greatest changes could be seen in the melting pot of the middle and working classes, who widely adapted European traditions with those brought from Africa or Native American culture. Wealthy Mexicans imported their fashions from Spain and also created a lively mixture of European and native traditions. 17th century fashions stayed in style for everyday people well into the 18th century. And so we will see items like the 17th century mantilla become a permanent part of the culture. Indigenous Mexican and South American culture included elaborate weaving in decorative motifs. This was adapted by the Spanish as embroidery and becomes an important part of Mexican clothing by the 18th century. The middle and working classes mixed Old World clothing traditions with those of the New, so we owe the dawning of American style to workers, not to the wealthy. This begins a trend that is opposite of the European tradition of imitating royalty, and we will see a distinct difference in the American approach to clothing in the next 200 years. The first fusion fashion was the hunting shirt and leggings. Europeans arrived wearing breeches that ended at the knee and stockings. This soon proved unworkable in the American landscape. Colonists borrowed leggings from the Native Americans to create longer pants. The native men, in turn, borrowed the Europeans' cloth shirt. While colonists wore the shirt under a vest or coat, Indians wore it as a garment by itself. Soon both native men and frontier men could be seen in variations of this outfit. The first corporate branded American fashion, and maybe even the world, comes to us from the Hudson's Bay Company, the oldest company in North America. It traded furs for wool blankets. In 1779, it commissioned an English textile mill to create a blanket prized for its warmth to trade. They specifically asked for these colored stripes as a marker. Both settlers and natives made coats out of these blankets, and the first branded fashion was born. Garments for enslaved workers were often made on the plantation, and many enslaved women were skilled weavers and sewers. Or there were small suppliers who made garments for sale. One of those suppliers would become Brooks Brothers Clothing in the next century. We have a valuable resource from this time, an autobiography by Oluwada Equiano, a Nigerian English writer and abolitionist. He was enslaved in the Caribbean, and after earning his freedom wrote a book about his adventures and those times. We also know about another interesting personality, an American preacher born in Rhode Island as Jemima Wilkinson. They awoke after a near-death experience shunning both a gendered identity and gendered pronouns. They gave up the old birth name and adopted the name of Public Universal Friend, forming a like-minded society of universal friends. The friend dressed in long clerical robes that were neither male nor female, and a male broad-brimmed Quaker hat. There's an extensive biography of the friend on Wikipedia if you'd like to know more. We have another notable moment in cultural history during the 18th century. Since costume shops are fond of chocolate, we will trace some chocolate milestones too. The early Industrial Revolution brought mechanical grinding to coffee houses, so the middle class could afford to drink coffee and chocolate. This family is drinking hot chocolate, which became all the rage. Notice how they are holding the cups with no handles, and of course, the dog wants some too. Which brings us to the end of our 18th century review. Our notable 18th century dog is the Dalmatian, which was bred to run in front of a coach to clear the way for the horses. In the 18th century, steering systems were greatly improved so that old lumbering wagons evolved into coaches nimble enough to turn corners in city streets. It's interesting to me to think that streets were obviously getting so crowded with the newfangled coaches that we needed a dog to clear the way. So owning a Dalmatian meant you obviously owned a modern coach as well.